So, welcome to Ecocriticism 101 and our final lecture of the main sequence, which is number 16. So, let me just show you how that looks on the Prezi. So, we started way down here, if you remember, at Mesopotamia. We worked our way up through the first half of the lectures, all the way here to number 16. And we will conclude today, and this is on Rachel Carson, and then we'll jump to Buddhism. And, I thought I'd just explain what that's about, that jump, just to prepare you for it. We've looked at one particular tradition, the Western tradition. And, that's kind of a problem. It is unequivocally a problem insofar as we've ignored, in some sense excluded, all the rest of the traditions on the planet. I didn't do that because I think that the Western tradition is the best and the greatest and we should care most about it. Not at all. I think many of the other traditions, I think all the other traditions in their own way are every bit as valuable and all. The Western tradition, however, is our tradition. This is a course in English literature. We ultimately conclude it with English literature. And moreover, this Western tradition has now swept the world, not only in language, although that is true. English language is spread all over the world, and people in many other places learn English in addition to their own. But the culture itself has been extremely influential in a variety of different ways, and you could have courses about that in and of itself. But in particular, it's been influential on how we relate to the environment. So for our class, that's what we've focused on. What were the features of the Western relationship to the environment? Where do they come from? And we've looked at the long history of Western thinking as recorded in text to see that. But I thought it would be interesting, and this is why we're doing another lecture after this, number 17, which is on Buddhism, because it is interesting to look at another culture. We could have looked at any number of other cultures, but Buddhism, I think, is interesting, one, because it's has such a large influence on the world, and because in so many ways it's a counterpoint to Western thinking. So we've seen, for example, the preoccupation in the West with the idea of constant presence, to use the term that Heidegger would use, or just the notion that there is this metaphysical realm, that there's something beyond this realm, some other place. Well, in certain varieties of Buddhism, that does exist as well, but it's been argued by really Buddhist thinkers for a long time, since the very beginning, arguably the Buddha, that doesn't exist, that there is no metaphysical realm. And moreover, the fact that everything is constantly changing. Remember, we had that with Heraclitus, and which is, seen as a problem or a shortcoming in some way in the Western tradition. Well, that's celebrated in Buddhism. So it couldn't be more different of a tradition in the sense that one of the core beliefs, this notion in the metaphysical realm, is just arguably not there. And we're going to see certain, Buddhist thinkers today, like Thich Nhat Hanh, who is a Zen Buddhist monk, from Vietnam, and very influential, some would argue the most influential Buddhist thinker today. He takes a different tact on it, and so we'll see that. But before going to that, we have our final lecture on the Western tradition, which is a very important one, I would argue, or especially the thinker that we're going to be encountering today, the thinker and writer, Rachel Carson, is just so important because she consolidates so much of what we've seen in Western thinking and uses it. And it's to inaugurate the modern environmental era in the sense of environmentalism that has emerged in the last 70 years or so. And Carson, some people would probably say that Carson inaugurated the modern environmental movement herself. I think that's a little too simple. I think she's clearly a major figure in it, but there are a lot of other forces that were in play, and ultimately, the movement would have begun without her, but her intervention brings it about in a certain kind of way. So I guess what I'm saying, it wouldn't have been the same movement if it hadn't been for Rachel Carson. It would have been a little different. But let's go back and look at her, and she will again conclude the regular sequence series here. So here we are, lecture 16, and let's jump right into a quote from Rachel Carson. If facts are the seeds that later produce knowledge and wisdom, then the emotions and the impressions of the senses are the fertile soil in which these seeds must grow. So, fascinating quote here, right? So facts are important according to Carson here. Knowledge is important, but the emotions and the impressions of the senses are the fertile ground and the seed where they must grow. So it's a truism, I think, and it's just simply saying that facts are one thing, but they have to have an emotional connection for this to work for people. This is where it will grow in the emotions and the impressions of the senses. So she's really weighing in on the same thing that Plato was weighing in on. But her argument here is that the emotions are important, and I think that shows up throughout the work, because if we just didn't care, if we didn't care about the planet at all, this movement, this environmental movement would have never happened. You need that. You need an emotional connection to what's going on. You need to connect up with it and care about the planet, care about its preservation, its conservation. Because otherwise, the phrase, save the planet wouldn't really make much sense. And although, to be clear, we have to do more than save the planet in the sense, that the Earth is going to continue on without us. That's not really quite the issue. We need to preserve the planet for, to make it hospitable and welcoming for human life and all life. So it's really about saving it for life, or really there should be a little corollary after that, save the planet for us human beings. Because at the end of the day, I think that's anthropocentrism is still alive in that thought. But anyhow, to do that, you need to be emotionally connected with it, according to Rachel Carson. And I think she's absolutely right. So let's talk about this notion of biocides rather than pesticides. Carson is aware of the fact that calling for radical lifestyle changes, such as a complete ban on pesticides, would likely not be well received. So what she does is to draw attention to its widespread indiscriminate use, such as DDT being sprayed on millions of inhabited acres to kill gypsy moths. So Carson is tactical here, I would argue. So instead of just calling for an outright ban at this period in time, where people, where many people going into reading Silent Spring would have been sort of pro-science and seen these sort of chemical innovations that were being introduced as a good thing, Carson, has to proceed kind of carefully. So what she really wants to do, and it's a good point to make, because you would think this book is just saying ban DDT, which is what happens. But really the focus on it is sort of transitioning into that by drawing attention to the indiscriminate, spraying of DDT. So as a consequence to this sort of tactical approach, Carson, unlike Thoreau, prompted direct and widespread action. So we might think of, her as too conservative in the mold of Thoreau. And what I mean by that is Thoreau calls for radical lifestyle changes. He says, drop your life and go out and live in the middle of wilderness or semi-wilderness area. Yeah, that's a lot to ask of people. Who's going to actually do that? I mean, sure, there are people who read Thoreau and did just that. There were people in the 60s generation, especially, who did that and started communes and lived in places like Walden Pond. Sure. But I think that's too much to potentially too much to ask of your readers to do that. So her strategy, though, as I note here, nonetheless affected radical change very quickly. And more than any other person, I think it's safe to say that Rachel Carson is responsible for the EPA being created in the 1970s. Sure, other people played a role, and surprisingly, perhaps, given his politics, it's a complicated situation, but Richard Nixon is really the person that's the sitting president at the time who brings about the EPA and certainly endorsed it. But we wouldn't have gotten to that position if Rachel Carson hadn't kicked this off, many years before, quite a few years before. So it's an interesting thing to reflect upon here about impacting the world. How do you impact the world? Well, you couldn't write a book like Thoreau and call for radical changes to individuals, or you could take Rachel Carson's position, stand back a little and say, well, how do we transition into that? If you're asking people to change their lives, may not work. If you're asking for them to take up one particular issue, not even pesticide use or biocide use, but one chemical in particular, DDT, and even then to focus on its indiscriminate use, that's more likely going to work. It does raise a question, though, about where we are right now with the climate crisis as to which tack to take. Because unfortunately, we've waited so long, many decades now, at least 5 decades, we really should have been acting, that it's just, not possible to take a slow approach to it. I mean, Rachel Carson, you can see where this approach worked well over these, 7 decades because we, sort of sequentially moved through problem after problem once we set up an organization like the EPA and had other laws in effect. That's great. And I think that proved to work very well. But it does raise a question, if we would have acted on the climate crisis at that point in time, yeah, things would have been different. It's safe to say that Carson has shaped modern environmental discourse more than Thoreau. Partly because, remember, Thoreau is looking away from environmental problems. He's looking to what he imagines or portrays as a pristine place, which is the area around Walden Pond. But, Carson, unflinchingly looks at environmental problems. She doesn't, we know she cares about the environment, and that, the opening 3 pages, which is sort of a celebration of, country life, pastoral life, sure. But the book really is focusing on environmental issues, and that has very much shaped modern environmental discourse. You could see 2 strains in environmentalism, but I think that's a little simplistic. But what they would be those following Thoreau. So what has Thoreau done, that group done then? Well, in a way, it's what, at least up through the 20th century, we thought of as environmentalism, as an environmentalist. So what do environmentalists do? Well, they protect wilderness, right? They go chain themselves to trees. They worked for the preservation of national parks. They're worried about development anywhere happening, and that's what they're doing. Well, that's one group of environmentalists, and I don't in any way mean to diminish them, but you can see how that's sort of coming out of Thoreau's tradition, the preoccupation with wilderness. Rachel Carson sort of inaugurates another type of environmentalism that's less concerned about wilderness areas than the areas that human beings inhabit. And what are we doing in those places that we inhabit? For example, are we indiscriminately using biocides? Yeah. Are we tainting our water? Are we tainting our air? Are we, doing all sorts of things? That is that approach, and that will be the approach of environmentalists dealing with the climate crisis, because it's the places that human beings inhabit that are the problem, insofar as that's where greenhouse gas emissions are coming from. It may be forest areas, but it's the deforestation that's the problem. So what's happening in Indonesia, for example, so back in 2015, Indonesia had greenhouse gas emissions greater than the United States. Given how many greenhouse gas emissions the U.S. had, that's rather remarkable. But how did little Indonesia, which is like a tenth of the size of the U.S., do that? Well, through deforestation, through burning down forests. And, that then became human-controlled areas. So, yes, for the first wave Thoreau type environmentalists would have wanted to preserve those forests for sure. But once they got under human control, then you see the problem. And pretty much wherever human beings are, we're emitting greenhouse gases. And the focus really wouldn't be on wilderness necessarily, because most of the emissions that human beings are making are coming from cities right now, because that's where you have so many people. And so for an environmentalist like Rachel Carson, that's where the focus is. The focus is on where human beings are, not where human beings aren't, which interested Thoreau and a group of environmentalists. So Carson has, again, it's too simple to say that there are just two kinds of environmentalists, but Carson has certainly influenced the second, which is now, I think, rightfully and necessarily, prominent in the United States because of the climate crisis and how to address that. So Carson, again, her primary objection was not just to DDT, but its widespread use and the notion that it was being, harmless to human beings. So here you have different ways in which it is being used here. So you see people here using it directly, spraying it directly around human beings. This is actually the notion that human beings are treated for things like lice by spraying it directly on human beings. Here's an airplane. So you may know that when you travel, a concern is that when human beings go from place to place, that they may bring insect pests to one area to another. So the solution was just spray DDT right into the cabin of an airplane. This is the common, there are two major dispersion methods and used at the time. One were trucks like this. And so what the trucks were doing was actually spraying DDT right out of the back of the truck. And these trucks would go around communities and spray everywhere. So it's not like people were just spraying it in their yard or something. The municipalities and the government had taken on the job of spraying it everywhere that they possibly could. This sort of misty fog, looked safe, and people were not told that it wasn't. So you actually had, and it was quite an event apparently when trucks like this went around, children would run behind it to run in the fog and to play in it, and that was thought to be pretty cool. So you can see Carson's concern here, but the biggest thing, and I show it here, this is an airplane that is actually using the crop dusting technology to spread DDT everywhere. So whole communities, whole counties would be crisscrossed back and forth, spraying DDT everywhere to kill, all the insects there. Now, this is a problem to Carson. So it's not, again, just that DDT is being used, but all this, how it's being deployed, whether it's, out there where children are able to run around in it, or whether it is, blanketing whole communities and, counties and areas of the United States. That's the issue she wants to draw attention to, just how widespread this stuff is, and the problem there. So ecology. We've had this notion before. But Carson really, more than anyone else, introduces ecology to Americans, to people in the United States. We really didn't, the average person on the street didn't really know what ecology was before. Yes, Ernst Haeckel had coined the term almost 100 years before. He's a biologist, and scientists would have known, of course, many of them, but the average person on the street didn't. So here's how Rachel Carson explains ecology. It's a famous passage, and it's worth repeating here. For each of us, as for the robin in Michigan or the salmon in the Miramichi, this is a problem of ecology, of interrelationships, of interdependence. We poison the caddisfly in the stream, and the salmon wrens dwindle and die. We spray our elms, and the following springs are silent of robin song. Not because we sprayed the robins directly, but because the poison traveled step by step through the now familiar elm leaf, earthworm, robin cycle. These are matters of records, observable, part of the visible world around us. They reflect the web of life or death that scientists know as ecology. So yeah, most people wouldn't have known what ecology was, but Carson breaks it down in a very simple way. That, Ernst Haeckel said all life is related. And, we look in individual areas, systems where life is related, and we call those ecosystems because there's an interrelationship. And Carson draws attention to this. What do? You spray this chemical on say leaves, say elm leaves, and it lands there. And what happens? Well, earthworms eat it when it falls to the ground because that's what they do. That's how, decomposition takes place in part. Earthworms are eating it. They're ingesting this chemical. Then what happens is, in turn, robins eat earthworms and they ingest this chemical DDT as well. This then presents a problem for robins because they're building this chemical up in their bodies. And as I noted before, this, among other things, keeps them from being able to manufacture or in their bodies to produce, sufficient shells for their eggs. Shells become weak. They are never, able to be born. They are never able to, to result in a bird being born. So suddenly, because of what had been spread on leaves, now the bird population is dropping off dramatically. And Carson wants to draw attention to this, that it's all interrelated, that you can't, the notion that the chemical companies put out there that this is sort of like a little guided missile heading straight for the animal or insect that you wanted to destroy, that it was an insecticide, that it just killed insects. It's just not right. It's out there and everything is interconnected. So ultimately it gets everywhere, including, I'll note in a slide in a minute, to human beings as well. So is an important idea to get out there, because if you don't understand ecology, then this doesn't make sense. And since most Americans didn't understand ecology, that it really meant that they weren't able to understand the nature of the problem that DDT presented, because again, it might have seemed that this just targeted insects, but it's not the way it worked. And Carson, had to first explain to Americans what ecology is. And by the end of this decade, the 1960s, that will become a rallying cry. People will know what ecology is and be very concerned about thinking about it. She, talks about, in a very clever way, that ecology is not this sort of outside the body, but inside. There's also an ecology of the world within our bodies. In this unseen world, minute causes produce might effects. To discover the agents of disease and death depends on a patient piecing together of many seemingly distinct and unrelated facts. In a way that Carson never knew and wasn't known at her time. That's more true than she could imagine. The human biome, as we now know, that, as we walk around and we think of ourselves as self-contained individuals, but, maybe 10 times as many cells as we have in our body are not part of us, but part of other life that lives on and in us, that's a big ecology. And we depend on that very much, right? So even, on our skin, we have, a biome, microbes that exist. They're not human cells, but they're very important because the sort of oils that we have on our skin are produced there. If we didn't have this biome, our skin would crack and be a huge problem. And in the same way, we wouldn't be able to digest things that we're able to digest without our biome inside. So we are, and Carson, gets it right here, we are very dependent on that ecology. That ecology is who we are. It's an unseen world, as she notes here, but it can have, as she further notes, big effects, might effects in the world. But it really requires someone, and Carson's almost making a nod to herself here, someone to patiently piece together the seemingly distinct and unrelated facts. So Carson is doing it, but look, the scientists that she's reading and whose work she's reporting on did this. They pieced together what was going on and they figured it out. It's sort of investigative work, because how would you know, what this chemical is doing unless you systematically studied it, looked through what was going on, in areas as far as like bird populations and all, and pieced it all together. So it is like detective work, but it is a great move for her to begin thinking about how this impacts us individually. Because if you're not on board for the idea that we should, preserve the environment because it's important, and things like birds and all are important, if you're just super selfish and say it's all about me, I don't care about me, very anthropocentric, well, you'd still would want to buy into this because, you're ingesting this and it's in your body as well. So, so she is really in part, and I say in part responsible here. I should really rewrite that and say largely responsible for popularizing the notion of ecology. Yeah, Hegel, of course, introduces the term almost 100 years before, but, Carson not just introduces it to the American public very effectively. I mean, by the end of the decade, pretty much everyone will know what ecology is in the United States. So she also does something that Hegel doesn't focus on. So Hegel, the way to think of it is, Hegel talks about the interrelationship of everything, the way when it's all working great, when the ecosystem works. So if you went out to a place where there's no human habitation and you looked at an ecosystem, you could see it functioning very clearly if you did that detective work and all. But what Carson is not interested so much in that and how it works when everything's okay, but when it breaks down. So it's a study of ecology, but ecology under stress, or ecology, or more specifically, ecosystems under stress, ecosystems that are endangered. And that notion of endangered ecosystems will resonate, I think, with the American people. And suddenly people are going to be aware of the fact that, throughout the United States and the planet, that ecosystems are being endangered, not because of any, so-called natural cause. It's not like there's a population of a certain animal increase, and that's what we should be worried about. But what human beings are doing are threatening and disrupting, and in some cases, outright destroying ecosystems. And Carson wants to draw attention to that fact. So it's an interesting move, right? Because she's simultaneously introducing the notion of ecology to America, to the United States, but also introduce at the same time that ecosystems are being disrupted. So it's an intriguing idea. I mean, would have Americans, people in the U.S. listened 100 years before if someone like Hegel talked about, how it is when ecosystems work? Well, maybe people would have cared. Some people, sure. But I think you really get the attention of the public when you say that systems are being disrupted, and this will have profound implications for, among other things, human beings. Carson, and this is what's so important about how she introduces ecology, she makes very clear that a seemingly minor change can disrupt an ecosystem. So let's say that you can just poison a particular variety of insect, which is the claim made by the chemical companies. This initiates a series of events that will cause problems over a long period of time because they accumulate in the bodies of animals. So not in terms of pesticide or biocide. What is a biocide? Would be mercury in salmon and other fish, principally tuna. So what happens here is we dump mercury into the oceans. Mercury is an industrial byproduct, and we've been doing this for quite some time, many decades. Well, all fish then take this into their body. Salmon is less of a problem because it's a short-lived fish. It's not all that large, and it doesn't accumulate a whole lot in its body. Tuna, however, are much larger fish, live much longer, and accumulate more. So they're sort of taking the mercury into their bodies, every day as, water is being processed through their bodies, but the mercury stays, and that will accumulate over a long period of time. And it's a very minute amount. So like a daily dose of it is going to be insignificant, pretty much. It's not going to have much of a consequence, but over many, many years, it will accumulate in the body. And Carson wants to draw attention to that this can cause problems for surprisingly long periods of time, and can be an issue. So it's not just that, like, spraying one time is a problem, which it is. It often is, and the proof would be that it's effective at what it's supposed to do, that insects immediately die. But it stays in the ecosystem, and it doesn't go away, and it accrues. And as it accrues, then you have an issue. So in other words, it's not just that the robin eats that earthworm. One earthworm may not be a problem, but eating more and more and more, just like the way it accrues in the body of like a tuna, it will accrue in the body of an animal, which is why, incidentally, in terms of the mercury example, that people suggest that you should definitely limit the amount of seafood that you eat, that if you eat too much seafood, it will happen with you too. Your body will accumulate mercury, and mercury can poison you. There's something called mercury poisoning. So we have to be very careful about that. I think before Carson's era, before Carson herself, most people just were not aware of that. Because of Carson and the people who followed her, were aware of this now. So I think many people may know, having too much seafood is a problem for this very reason that Carson is drawing attention to. But one of the difficulties here, and it has to do with that detective work, is that these ecosystems are just incredibly complex. So Edward Lorenz is one of the people who originates the idea of chaos theory, generally acknowledged as the person who does, argued that large-scale environmental systems, such as involving weather and climate, or weather in particular, are so complex and chaotic that they will never be effectively modeled or predicted. So you may know this, according to Lorenz, even a single butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil will alter the weather in the U.S. So this is where chaos theory sort of originates, by focusing on weather. So all it means is that there's so many factors at play in an ecosystem. And that's right. I mean, just imagine, say, an ecosystem, a forest. All the life there. So not only all the animals there, diverse amounts of them, but all the plants there, all the microbes there. It's staggeringly complex how this functions. And it is sort of calculating itself in real time. It's like one massive analog calculator describing what's going to happen. But you start making little changes to it. You remove, say, one form of life, like a key predator or something, then everything changes. And it's very hard to calculate what those impacts are going to be, and that's part of the problem if you start altering an ecosystem, because there just may be changes that you just never imagined would be significant, and yet everything sort of, falls like dominoes from it. And doing something like, such a large-scale way, introducing a biocide into an ecosystem by spraying DDT from an airplane, that's going to change everything, and in ways that we just may not know. And that's what makes it such a dicey business to be intervening in ecosystems the way that human beings have, because we're just not sure what will happen. But now, of course, we know, as time has gone on, we see the impacts of all our intervention on the planet, and now we know that we are in the middle of a sixth extinction event. So you may know, I mentioned this before, the fifth extinction event, dinosaurs were killed 66 million years ago. Now we're in the middle of number 6, and this one is potentially going to be faster and larger, and life is dying at the rate of as much as 50,000 species are going extinct every year across the planet. This is because of human action, not necessarily spraying biocides, although that's part of it, putting CO2 and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, where they're being absorbed into the oceans, both warming the temperature of the planet, warming the oceans, adding to the acidity of the oceans. All these changes are profound, and so in the case of CO2, putting in the atmosphere, yes, it warms things. But to give an example, the atmosphere is in contact with the ocean, of course, of 3/4 of the planet. That CO2 is absorbed into the ocean, as well as the increased temperature that it brought about through the greenhouse effect. But absorbed directly into the oceans, it increases the acidity of the oceans. There's a lot of life in the ocean that can't deal with increased acidity, and you can't get away from it because it's spreading across all the oceans. And an example would be, an unfortunate one would be coral, like coral reefs. Coral reefs across the planet are now dying. Half of them on the planet have died, and they're dying at an alarmingly quick rate. By the year 2050, probably 90% of all coral will die. Why? Well, if you didn't know, coral, it looks like a rock, right? But it's not, and it's not a plant, it's actually an animal. Coral just can't deal with the increased heat that has been transferred from the atmosphere to the ocean, but the acidity too. So it's like a dilute form of an acid, and it can't tolerate it, and it dies. This is the problem. We do things that we haven't really thought about. So yes, we released massive amounts of DDT in the atmosphere, but that pales by comparison in the amount of CO2 and other greenhouse gases like methane and, hydrides of nitrogen and all. So these are profound changes that we never really thought about the consequences of them because they're so complex. Now that we're beginning to figure out what's happening, it's very concerning. Yeah, one of the reasons that Silent Spring was so influential was that it was exceptionally well promoted and distributed. So in addition to being published like a regular book, it was serialized in its entirety in the New Yorker magazine, which was, read by a lot of people. So you didn't have to buy the book, just keep subscribing to the New Yorker and you'll get it all. Similarly, it was excerpts appeared in Audubon magazine, also important at the time, but bigger at the time, and it's not really, I don't know if it's still around today, but it was very influential, was the Book of the Month Club. So people would subscribe to this, and every month you would get a new book, sort of like the Oprah Book Club or something, but at the time, a lot of Americans subscribed to this because you wanted to get like whatever the it book at the time was, and Silent Spring was one of them. So lots and lots of people knew about Silent Spring even before it was published. So the president at the time, JFK, actually commented on Silent Spring during a news conference. He was asked what he thought about it before the book was even published as a book. So it was very, very well known, in part because of the fact that Carson was a well-known writer, and it just immediately made a big splash. But before it was even published, the chemical industry came out on the offensive and attacked it. So they tried to have the book stopped from publication. They said it was libelous, it was spreading lies, and it shouldn't be published. And they brought lawsuits against the New Yorker and Audubon magazine. To the credit of the publisher of the book and the New Yorker and Audubon magazine, none of them caved to this pressure. They all went and published it anyhow. But it was, from the very beginning, from before it even, was technically published, this was a very controversial thing. And it's not like the industry just, decided to, what would have been the best case scenario if the industry would have said, oh, gee, we never realized this, we're going to stop using it and all. But no, industry, doubled down and attacked and got into attack mode and attacked Carson and attacked the movement, the environmental movement that it spawned. Yep. One of the arguments made, and this argument actually is coming back now with the climate crisis, is that, well, these things, like whether it's DDT or fossil fuels, yeah, maybe they are causing harm. Let's just decide that. So By the way, with the fossil fuel industry and climate change denial, it took a long time for those groups to get there. So I teach whole courses in climate change denial literature, and I can tell you that there are all sorts of ways of denying the climate crisis, that people deny that it's being caused by human beings or that it's as bad as it is and things like that. But we're kind of entering a new era of climate change denial in that it's very difficult to deny that it's actually happening because you can see the impact all over. Wildfires in California increase, hurricanes and all. So once that's acknowledged and the American public is finally there, which we are now in the third decade of the 21st, I think it's safe to say we are in the United States. Well, then maybe finally we're going to have action. But again, the corporations that are trying to stay alive here and thrive, like the fossil fuel industry, they argue that, well, okay, yeah, but it's just going to be too much to change this because fossil fuels do far too much good. We need to keep them because, yeah, there's a downside, but they do far too much good. That was the case here with DDT too. So, and the fossil fuel industry, by the way, has looked at, I think, it's pretty clear, looked at the history of all sorts of successful campaigns in the past, and I think one of them must be DDT and chemicals like it. Because the argument made here is that in what I call the developing world here, I mean low to moderate income countries, DDT was used to help suppress the spread of malaria. And, this was a huge, problem with human beings. Malaria, and still is, although that might be changing very quickly, but with a vaccine. But the argument was simply this, that what we have to do is weigh the benefits to human beings against the downside. And that takes us back to the very beginning of the course, really, with Gilgamesh. What would be the benefit of cutting down the cedar forest? To Gilgamesh, it was huge, right? This was, going to bring prosperity to his city and, of course, fame and immortality to him. So, that's what the public is really asked to do, to weigh the downside against the benefits. And, the attack on environmentalism early on, which is still alive and well today, because it had been worked out here and before, but especially after, is simply that, well, are we really caring about a few birds when we're talking about human lives here? I mean, hundreds of thousands of people are dying of malaria every year. We could stop this, but we're gonna be, our hands are going to be tied by a group of environmentalists who care about birds more. You're going to hear this argument again and again in the decades to come, and today too, that human needs are greater than the environment. And again, that's back to Gilgamesh, this idea that, we need these resources and that's all there is to it. Or in this case, it's a little turned around because it's not resources, but we need to do what we're doing for human reasons. It benefits human beings. It saves the lives of human beings, and that warrants us doing whatever we're doing. Obviously, it is a completely anthropocentric argument. It is favoring human interests over those of the planet, other species, but it's still alive and well today in a big way. Yeah, again, that shouldn't be there. Sorry. So, Silent Spring, last set of slides here. This debate continues today. And what I mean by that is not just the general debate that we had about, whether we should be using chemicals in the environment, changing the environment, putting CO2 and all. All that is still obviously debated today, and these will come after Silent Spring. I mean, just to be very clear, though, we knew about climate change back during the time of Silent Spring. Scientists had talked about it. Just a couple years, 3 years after Silent Spring is published, the president at the time, Lyndon B. Johnson, will actually address the issue on the floor of Congress and talk about global climate change. So we're clearly aware of it today. They were clearly aware of it even then, something like climate change. But the specific arguments here will continue to be debated. So let me show you what I mean by that. This is a British politician, Dick Treverne, essentially compared Rachel Carson to Adolf Hitler in 2005, or with the other dictators of the first half of the 20th century, like Mussolini and all. So here's his quote. Carson didn't seem to take into account the vital role that DDT, played in controlling the transmission of malaria by killing the mosquitoes to carry the parasite. It is the single most effective agent ever developed for saving human life. Rachel Carson is a warning sign to us all of the dangers of neglecting the evidence-based approach and the need to weigh potential risk against benefit. It can be argued that the anti-DDT campaign she inspired was responsible for almost as many deaths as some of the worst dictators of the last century, i.e. Hitler, Mussolini, and those folks. Remarkable statement. And again, it's not even a general attack on environmentalism and environmentalists like Rachel Carson, but specifically, they're not going to let it die. The DDT is a problem here, and that the argument that Carson didn't seem to take into account the vital role it played for human beings. Carson fully knew that, and as far as the transmission of malaria and all, Carson fully knew that. And the closing chapter of the book, she really addresses this issue directly with malaria and all. But again, this is the anthropocentric argument rolled out counter to the environmental one, the ecological one, which is concerned about ecosystems here. So Carson is concerned about how ecosystems are going to be disrupted. Dick Treverne here is arguing that, what about human beings? This is all about human beings. You have to understand, this is like the single most effective agent we've ever had to stop DDT. Carson, incidentally, in the concluding chapter 17 of Silent Spring, really is hoping that the problem could be solved in another way. And people have continued doing this work, including at UCSB. And that is that it wouldn't be solved chemically by way of a biocide. But basically, and people have argued that Carson would have been in favor of genetic manipulation of DNA research because Carson hopes that a biological approach might be able to intervene here. So, and this is what, Treverne doesn't address, is that Carson specifically says, well, how could we stop this mosquito cycle here? And she argues if we could render, sterile the mosquitoes that are spreading it, their population would die. If we could do that biologically, and maybe there'd be a way through genetic modification to do it. So that has absolutely been argued. So, but again, this is a continual attack on environmentalism, even Rachel Carson, 50 years later, 40-odd years later here, on these grounds. So it's alive and well today. So this is actually a person speaking during the second Bush administration for the Department of Health, noting that the ban on DDT may have killed 20 million children. So this raises this age-old debate, of how human interests should be weighed against the planet's, which, again, we see from the very beginning of the term, and now we're seeing it at the very end of the term, and the legacy of the very end of the term. Carson is writing, 70 years ago, but do people still buy into that attack on her? And they still absolutely do that. And by the way, there are other ways, even aside from chemical or biological intervention, that can be very very effective here. And a simple one is known as the mosquito net. So, the focus that these attacks on Traverne and Gvatz here have made are on, the focus is on children, because children are most susceptible to malaria, in the sense that, they're more likely to kill them than an adult. And infants are particularly vulnerable here. But there's a simple way, something called a mosquito net. So you have a child in a crib, you put a mosquito net over it. If you've been out camping, you've probably had tents that have mosquito netting in it that lets air in but keeps, even small bugs out. And that's what's being suggested here. And people have done this and have spread them all over, mosquito nets all over low and moderate income countries, because here's a way, children are all, lying there in a crib. They're not moving around a lot. They're isolated, and you can just put a little piece of mosquito netting over and hopefully save their lives. So the argument here is that, and you see it with the climate crisis as well, that these solutions are what's necessary, that they're what's most important, the only way. So in other words, if you're going to stop malaria, you need DDT, period. We want to save human lives, we need DDT, period. Well, no. There are other solutions. Carson hopes it's going to be what she calls biotic or biological interventions, but there are other things as simple as a mosquito net. Similarly, with the climate crisis, you will hear people argue now, but we need fossil fuels. Our economy is built on them. There's no alternative. We have to use them. But that's simply wrong, because there are alternatives. We call them alternate energy or renewable energy, which addresses more the fact that it's renewable rather than a finite resource like fossil fuels. So, if you buy into the attack, it's all made, by an industry wanting to keep these chemicals alive and in use, whereas, there may simply be other ways of approaching the problem. In some sense, returning to another idea from early in the course, a genus loci, we begin in the early modern period to see the suggestion made by Amelia Lanier, Ben Jonson, and others that human beings should be protectors of place. Amelia Lanier felt that homosocial group of women who lived in the Cookham estate were, performing a really important role. They were protecting the estate, the grounds there. And in a way, they're just like, similar to Humbaba in the Epic of Gilgamesh. His job was to protect the forest. Their job, as Lanier imagines it, is to protect the place. Similarly, Ben Jonson believes that his patron, Robert Sidney, is protecting the estate at Penshurst. And he goes into detail explaining how wonderful the place is. It's sort of an over-the-top portrayal of it being like a wildly successful ecosystem, but that's the work of a human being. So, Carson is really suggesting here that environmentalists are the new genus loci. They're taking on this role the way it's imagined by people like Lanier. And, what are they protecting it from? The environment from? Well, it's the same thing as genus loci figures. I noted at the very beginning of the term, who were they to protect the environment from? Well, not from animals. That's not what genus locis were generally doing. Or from gods or something like that, where you have religions where gods walk around on the planet. No, they're protecting place, they're protecting the environment from human beings. And this new 20th century genus loci environmentalists are doing just that. They're protecting the planet from human beings who would harm or exploit it. And as we've seen, there are lots of those human beings. So there's plenty of work for genus loci in the 20th century in the form of environmentalists who are needed to protect protect the planet, protect ecosystems, protect individual species from human beings who would exploit or otherwise hurt them. Yeah. So if you think about it, then we've come full circle from that because the hero of the epic Gilgamesh, is Gilgamesh, the king, who would endanger, and I note here, recklessly exploit the environment. They are no longer the heroes of our stories. Maybe the people who were attacking Rachel Carson, I'm sure they might cast the heroes of the story as the chemical companies that produce DDT, as the oil companies that extract fossil fuels. Maybe if they were telling the story, they would be the heroes. But for the most part, thanks to Rachel Carson and the modern environmental movement, we've had a shift that the heroes, are not, the genus Loki here are not monstrous like Humbaba or portrayed as monsters. That is, of course, exactly what we just saw happening. So, I'm sorry, but if you're comparing Rachel Carson to Adolf Hitler, yeah, you're saying she's a monster. I don't know how else you would portray that characterization. But for many people who have been influenced by the modern environmental movement, you would think of it as just the opposite, that Rachel Carson is the hero of the story. Yeah, some people might want to portray her as monsters, and the chemical industry and the fossil fuel companies as the heroes, but I don't think most people are buying into that rhetoric nowadays. And with this, by the way, is not only that the hero is the genus Loki, but the readers, the people who are taking all this in, are encouraged to take on the role themselves as genus Loki. And I note here, fighting the habit of killing that many industries are in, presumably to help human beings in the planet. But as Carson notes, it doesn't work out that way. It's rather just the opposite. So with Al Gore, a little shift happens here that's noteworthy, as it's no longer a specific locale, right? So a genus Loki, that Loki in that phrase refers to locale, a specific place. And historically, genus Loki figures were, sort of moored to a specific place. Humbaba is a great example. He lives in that forest. It's a very, specific place. But, the issue of the climate crisis and in general, the spread of toxic materials all over the planet have made clear that, you need kind of a new kind of protector of place here who may act locally in protecting a place, who may, be concerned about the release of greenhouse gases right in your community if there's a fossil fuel powered power plant like a coal or gas fired power plant that's directly reducing CO2. You may act locally in trying to shut that down, but the consequences are global. So the new genus Loki are protecting a locale, yes, but a very general one that we call the planet Earth. I think that's where climate crisis activists as genus Loki are interested. But again, it doesn't mean that you can't be concerned about a specific locale. And arguably, you've heard that phrase, think globally, act locally, that, all these things don't, happen everywhere at once. They happen all sorts of individual places, and it can be very individual. It can be in your driveway, right? It's not a power plant, but your car, is producing CO2 and putting it into the atmosphere. Depending on your car, if your car gets like 20 miles a gallon, which is not all that low, then national average for a car right now, if I'm not mistaken, is 25 miles per gallon. But if it's 20 miles per gallon, for every mile that you drive, you're putting a pound of CO2, of carbon dioxide, directly into the atmosphere. So you can act very, very locally by driving less, eliminating your car, using other options like mass transit, personal mobility options, which like bicycles, some of which release no CO2 at all, like bicycles or mass transit, which is many, many times more effective than a car in terms of efficiency and in terms of corresponding emissions. So a bus, for example, like emits 1/14 of the emissions of a car. Some trains 1/35 or even less. So you can act in a very, very, very local way. As you may know, even the food that you eat and all is very important important. But we need to be thinking, in a planetary way right now, which, again, no genus loci really was there to protect the planet per se. That's actually, in some religions, may not be true. There are some genus loci are protecting everything, but certainly that's what's called for in the 21st, is for environmentalists to do that. Environmentalists also are less likely look to the past than to the future. Yeah, so Thoreau and people like him were more interested in the past in a way. So Thoreau saw modernity unfolding around him, principally at Lowell, Massachusetts, this huge textile manufacturing city. But Thoreau didn't want to look at the future. He wanted to look at sort of a past, bygone way of life that he is celebrating on the shores of Walden Pond. So in a way, he's sort of looking to the sort of lost paradise. He's in that model. So people like Carson and Al Gore and most modern environmentalists, they want to halt the planet's destruction in the future. They're looking toward the future. So obvious example is that the way we understand the climate crisis is through modeling of the future. We are looking at the future in very definite ways. So models extend out to the end of this century, the end of the 21st century. Models go, to the 2030, 2050. But in each case, we are firmly looking at the future. We're imagining futures, and it sounds like a sci-fi novel or a cli-fi novel. It kind of is. We're imagining which future we're going to go on, which future is going to be ours. And that's different. It's not looking back to the way we used to inhabit the Earth, but how do we inhabit the Earth with a global population that's now nearly 8 billion by the middle of the century, we may have, by 2050, nearly 10 billion people on the planet. There's never been anything like that before. How do we feed, clothe, transport, and all those things, that people need for that many people? That's a future problem. It's not a problem of the past. And environmentalists are definitely looking at the future now in a way that they may not have before, where it's just about preservation of wilderness, which is absolutely great. And I think Thoreau's era and his type of environmentalism is very important. But the environmentalism of the 21st century, I think, has to look to the future, and it's a bold new future, because there's no precedent for how 8 billion human beings inhabit this planet. You can't look back to another time where something like that happened. So in that sense, they're less interested, this new crop of environmentalists, in moving back to nature, or moving back to what once was, but it has to be looking forward. So in fact, the subtitle of my most recent book is called Forward to Nature. So instead of thinking about moving back, we need to move forward. We need to initiate a new movement, which is happening now, not of back to nature thinkers, but of forward to nature thinkers, that, as we've seen, we've never quite lived at peace with the planet, as any group of human beings, but maybe we can. But if it happens, it won't have happened in the past. It'll be in the future, and that, I think, is an optimistic thought, because we have to look to a brighter future than we've had. Silent Spring, I think, also, as a concluding text, addresses an issue that we've had, since the very opening of the course. We had in the first lecture, why approach environmental issues from a literary perspective. And I think non-scientific writers are often well positioned to disseminate environmental information to a broad audience, as they may, most clearly understand how the ideas that we have inherited historically emerged over time. I think Rachel Carson is a good example, although I think it's unfair to call her a non-scientific writer. She was a scientist, maybe not a research scientist, but she was, and she was certainly trained as one, and inculcated that knowledge quite well. But what we have to bring to the table from the side of the humanities and all is the ability to, engage a large audience through communication, especially. And someone like Al Gore is a great example who can take the message to millions of people worldwide. Again, he's certainly not a scientist, but he's capable of disseminating it and understanding it. And at the end of the day, here we are at the end, not of the day, but of the Prezi sequence, other than Buddhism, which we'll get to next time. But at the end of the day, it's the important thing is to be able to both communicate this and to see it as a human problem. So we can focus in on all the science, and it's absolutely great. And I think what Carson did and what the research scientists who went before her did with DDT is, absolutely essential. But it's not at root necessarily a scientific problem as much as it is a human one. And what I mean by that is it's human actions bringing all this about. It's human actions that created DDT, that, were responsible for the widespread use of it. It's human actions that are bringing about the climate crisis, whether large-scale actions of, big corporations and the wealthiest corporations on the planet measured by assets are fossil fuel companies, whether it's their actions or the individual actions of all of us in, doing things like, driving cars, eating beef, or, not participating in our democracy if you're in one where, we can actually vote politicians into office who would address that. But these are all human actions. Human actions, both brought about this problem in the sense of it's human beings who came up with and distributed, DDT, and it's human beings who stopped the problem, who led to the ban of DDT in the United States. It did not happen worldwide, by the way. It's still used in places worldwide. It's still used directly inside of dwellings worldwide, where people will spray it to kill things like mosquitoes inside of buildings and all. So, and this is often in low to moderate income countries where the companies that make these chemicals have found a market, which is disturbing. But anyhow, it is interesting to see this as a human problem, both that can be addressed in part by communicating the issue and in part by thinking about making human change. So, okay, this is not going to be as long as every lecture. I kind of pinpoint those very precisely to try to make them exactly 75 minutes. But I wanted to just give an overview of everything here and leave you with something to think about. So that'll be the lecture for today. And I guess it's really a bonus lecture we have coming next time. Buddhism as a way of, even though it's a non-Western way of thinking, it's meant to throw light on Western thinking, and hopefully it will. So, okay, that's it for today, and I will see you next time for our final lecture. Okay, take care.